One of my favorite restaurants in San Francisco is State Bird Provisions. You might have heard of it, it's pretty famous. It's known for its innovative cuisine that's served on dim sum carts, and it's got a Michelin star and a James Beard Award. I have a cookbook coming out October 24th, 2017, and I am so excited. I'm actually going to try to cook my way through it. Wish me luck. One of my favorite dishes, and also a staple of State Bird Provisions, is the pork belly salad. It's one of the few recipes that's also available online pre-cookbook release. You can find it on the 7by7.com website. What I love about this dish is that although the pork belly is quite fatty, every little ingredient helps to balance out the fat and makes the dish quite bright and flavorful. The first step is a 3-day brine. Now this is very specific. You need 1 3/4 cups plus 2.5 tablespoons kosher salt. I didn't choose this. This is the exact recipe. Next is 3/4 cup plus 1 tablespoon granulated sugar. After that is a 1/4 cup freshly cracked black peppercorns. I didn't have a way to freshly crack it. I don't have a coffee grinder or a blender, so I used a mortar and pestle and it seemed to work just fine. It's just a brine, so it doesn't need to be fine or anything. Add 16 cups of water. You're gonna need a pretty big bowl for this. I'm just using a spoon to try to dissolve all the sugar and the salt. The sugar dissolves pretty quickly, but the salt is taking a very long time. As you can see, I'm stirring and stirring and nothing is happening. Eventually I give up and I switch to a whisk, and that seemed to work better. Something else that can help a lot too is using room temperature water. You don't want to use cold because the salt will never dissolve, and you definitely don't want to use hot because that's going to cook the pork belly once you brine it. You are going to need 3 pounds of pork belly. I just got this from Whole Foods. Make sure the pork belly is even. Don't do what I do where one side was thicker than the other. That might create a little problem later on, but it's not a big deal. The recipe calls for putting the pork belly in a separate pan and pouring the brine over it. I didn't want to waste a bowl, so I just stuck it in the brine. If you do this, you'll notice that you can't push the pork belly down, and you may try to flip it to see if it goes down, and then realize, duh, science, nothing is going to sink if it's in salty water. If you place a bowl on top of this and the lid on top of that, the pork belly will definitely brine. Place this in the refrigerator for 3 days. It's been 3 days and you can take the pork belly out. You will notice that there's a slight dent in the skin. I actually missed a part of the recipe where it said to brine it skin side down. Thank goodness it doesn't really make a big difference in the long run. Now that the brining is done, we can cook the pork belly. Remove the pork belly from the brine and place it skin side down in a pan. The recipe doesn't say to wash off the brine. I think that's because you're going to braise the pork belly in water, so the flavor of the brine is going to be really helpful. Add 1 large rosemary sprig and 3 thyme sprigs. These are just from my garden. Go with the fresh herbs because it's going to add a lot more flavor. Next, you're going to add 5 crushed garlic cloves and 1 roughly chopped up onion. Pour enough room temperature water to cover the pork belly. This is the part that gets a little chefy. I'm not quite sure why the recipe calls for this, but you are going to put this on the stove top and bring the water to a boil before putting it into the oven. I would recommend preheating the oven to 375 at this point. I have a very old stove, so I know it's going to take a while for this to heat up. I can't really explain this part either, but once it starts boiling, you're going to place a piece of parchment paper on top of the pork belly and then wrap it up in aluminum foil. If anybody happens to know why parchment is needed before putting the aluminum foil on, please let me know because I am dumb and I don't know why, so I need someone to explain it to me. Another tip, remember to turn the fire off before putting the aluminum foil on. This pan was very hot and I actually needed to use a towel to put the aluminum foil on. The recipe doesn't say to let it cool down, so I'm assuming you're supposed to put the foil on while this pan is hot. Now that the foil's on, you are going to put this in the oven and cook for 2 to 2.5 hours. If you have a very old oven like me, it's probably going to be closer to 3 hours. pork belly is a pretty tough piece of meat. You'll know when it's done when you can stick a fork in it pretty easily. You see this amazing broth here? Don't throw that out. I actually ended up saving it and using it as a base for soups, and it is delicious. Once you're done marveling at the fat droplets, you can flip the pork belly over so it's skin side up and let it rest for 2 hours. Once the resting is done, this part is also pretty chefy. You have to press the pork belly. I think this is to condense the meat. That way when you fry it as the last step, it just doesn't fall apart and it stays as a nice solid meat cube. Line a pan with aluminum foil and place the pork belly skin side down. The recipe says to use parchment paper, but I ran out, so I'm using aluminum foil. It didn't really make a big difference in the end, so you can use whichever you want. Place a piece of aluminum foil on top of the pork belly and then a heavy bowl on top of that. Place in the refrigerator for 24 hours. Once you're done, you can remove the bowl and the foil, and oh my god, there is disgusting fat everywhere. Don't be alarmed by how it looks. This is how it's supposed to look. It will still taste fine. It's just ugly at this point. The next step is to cut the pork belly into 1.5-inch cubes. This part is a lot easier if you have even pork belly. Remember I mentioned earlier mine was slightly uneven? So this is the thinner side, and it's actually looking pretty good. There's a good amount of fat and meat. Just ignore the pig hairs. I'm going to cut that off in a little bit, but ideally this is what it should look like. This is the fatter side. So if you look at it, there's a lot more fat on top. So what I did was just lop off the top layer of fat. Don't throw this out though. If you fry it up, it will be the best bacon bits you will ever put on any salad. Once the pork belly is cut up, add 2 cups of cornstarch to the pork belly and make sure all the sides are evenly coated. So now we're going to deep fry the pork belly. I want to emphasize again that I have a very small kitchen. So frying something with this much moisture and fat was a little nerve-wracking because I'm terrified of getting splashed with hot oil. You can't hear it at this point, but I'm screaming because the oil just splashed me, so I put a lid on top. I generally am not dramatic, except when it comes to oil. If you can see how much moisture and oil is on this lid right now, you'll see how much was actually splattering up at me. As the hot oil is hitting my skin, I start to think about how much fat is in the pork belly and wondering if I could fry the pork belly in its own fat with a dry pan. I figure it wouldn't hurt, so we might as well try it. I'm setting the pork belly down on a pan at medium-high heat. My fear with this method is that the pork belly is going to dry out. First off, the pork belly fat doesn't fry as hot or as quickly as the canola oil that I was frying it in earlier. So anytime you cook something for a longer period of time, there's always a chance that it's going to dry out. So what's the difference so far? You can see that the deep fried areas are fried a little darker. Pan fried looks more pale. That's because I was afraid of drying it out. And honestly, the pan fried side was a little bit drier, but they still both taste delicious and they're both crispy. So you can cook this either way you want, in a dry pan or frying it in lots of oil. Once you're done frying, we can start on the vinaigrette. This is also very specific, so you need a 1/4 cup of fish sauce, preferably Red Boat brand, which is what I like anyway. A 1/4 cup plus 2 tablespoons lime juice. I grew up eating a lot of Vietnamese food, and I tend to like my fish sauce vinaigrettes a little more sweet, but this recipe calls for 1.5 teaspoons of granulated sugar, which is a lot less than what I would normally put in it. Finally, grate 1 small garlic clove because you don't want gigantic chunks in this sauce. And do the same thing for a 1/2-inch knob of ginger. Since this is a vinaigrette, add a 1/4 cup of grapeseed oil. I'm assuming that a vinaigrette is used instead of just a normal fish sauce because it can cling to all the ingredients better. The vinaigrette is pretty concentrated right now, so add a 1/4 cup plus 2 tablespoons of water and mix. Next step is plating. I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm just putting pork belly down. I'm gonna add the rest of the ingredients and just try to make it look pretty. In addition to the pork belly, the recipe says use 3 cups of winter citrus cut into bite-sized pieces. I decided to go with blood oranges, grapefruit, and mandarins. The citrus adds a lot of sweetness and acidity to this dish, so you really need it to balance out the fat. After you're done adding the citrus, you're going to get 1.5 cups of loosely packed mixed herbs and start scattering it around. I used pretty traditional herbs from Vietnamese cuisine: cilantro, mint, and Thai basil. Next ingredient, 1/2 inch jalapeno, very thinly sliced. If you don't like spicy food, you can leave the jalapeno out. This recipe also calls for Indonesian long peppercorns, which I could not find anywhere, so I left that out. You know, on closer inspection, it actually looks quite pretty, so I didn't do a horrible job. I think when you have ingredients like this, it's hard to make it look ugly. At this point, you can pour on the vinaigrette, as much or as little as you want. I wish I didn't run out of blood oranges. I think the red really brings out the green. This is a smaller test dish that I did earlier that when I still had blood oranges, and I think it looks a lot better. So that's it. If you try making this recipe, please let me know how it goes. If you have any comments or tips for me, I would love to hear them as well. I'm always willing to learn. Thank you for watching.